Will remember the blockbuster video shops at the end of the street, where you could rent a video for a couple of days and probably watch it 4 times to get value for money, even though the ending was still exactly the same. Well, in early 2000, they made a blockbuster blunder. They turned down the offer to buy Netflix's new streaming service for just $50 million. The reason? They said, we don't see any future in streaming. Within 10 years, Blockbuster went bust, and today Netflix is worth around $300 billion. See, Blockbuster Video failed to adapt to the changing culture around them, and it proved costly. In the last decade alone, we have seen huge changes in the digital revolution, in migration and population change, in spiritual and moral values. And in such a fast-changing culture, how do good news people remain relevant? How do we live within our culture, and where do we draw the line? How are we relevant without compromise? That's where today I want us to look at both Daniel and Paul. Daniel was relevant without compromise. As we read in chapter 1, he lived out his faith for everyone to see. He was a young man, probably as young as 16 or 17. He'd been taken away from his family, from his home, from the place of worship at the temple that he knew well. And as an exile in Babylon, he saw these massive, gigantic temples. And they heard the Babylonians celebrating their gods, whom they said gave them victory over the people of Judah. And in that city of Babylon alone, there were more than 50 temples to Marduk and other gods. The king set about trying to change Daniel and his friends. He changed their name, gave them a Babylonian name, often linked with one of their gods. The king insisted that Daniel learn the Babylonian literature, because in that he would learn the history of Babylon, the religion of Babylon, the culture and the way of life of Babylon. The aim? To get Daniel to conform to the custom and the ways of life in Babylon. But Daniel remained true to the Lord and to the Word of God. Daniel knew that Nebuchadnezzar had all these gods. And when Daniel was called to interpret a dream for the king, he made it very clear. I speak in the name of the God of heaven. When the king said to Daniel, well, I know the spirit of the gods is in you, Daniel was clear. You've had this dream so that you may know that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms of the world. Daniel would interpret the dream for the king, but let it be known, Daniel believes in the one God, the Most High. Daniel lived out his faith in very practical, real ways. If you read on a little bit further into the book of Daniel, you'll find that a day came when officials wanted to find a reason to accuse Daniel before the king. They wanted to get rid of Daniel. But they knew that Daniel was trustworthy. They knew that Daniel could not be bribed. And they realized that the only way that they would catch Daniel would be if they could find something to do with his faith and the Lord of God. They knew that Daniel prayed 3 times a day. So they went to the king and they persuaded the king to make a new law that for 30 days no prayer would be offered to any god anywhere, only to the king. Of course, that made the king feel really rather important, and foolishly he agreed. But David refused to compromise. David lived out his faith for everyone to see. And as we read through Daniel chapter 1, we find that he resolved not to defile himself. He had made that decision. And that's why when that time came, when food from the king's table and wine was prescribed for Daniel and his friends and was brought to them, Daniel explained carefully why he couldn't eat it. He had resolved not to defile himself. Literally, he put it in his heart. He had made a deliberate, conscious decision. The king could change his name. There was nothing Daniel could do about that. The king could make him read the Babylonian literature. Daniel had to go through with that. But the king could not change Daniel's devotion to the Lord. The reason? That Daniel had made a decision before any challenge came that he would remain loyal to the Lord. And so when the test did come, when the challenge to compromise occurred, Daniel already knew in his heart what he was going to do. There was a question, of course, as to why Daniel thought he would defile himself before God if he ate food from the king's table. It's probable that some of the food had been offered to idols and some of the wine poured out on a pagan altar. And Daniel didn't recognize those idols. He knew they were only idols. He knew that the Lord is the God of heaven, and Daniel remained loyal to the Lord. It may have been that some of the animals were unclean according to the Lord of God. I mean, in the end, we may not know exactly how or what it was that would defile him. But what we do know is Daniel was prepared to stand firm. Daniel would live in Babylon. Daniel could live with some of the ways of Babylon, as long as they did not conflict with his faith in God and the ethical demands of God. Daniel would not compromise. He would not change his beliefs to fit Babylonian culture, and he would not do something that he knew was wrong. But in all of that, please also see how Daniel showed great respect and tact. In verse 8, he asks permission not to eat the food from the king's table. Now that required courage. But he didn't shout or scream, he didn't demand something else, but he asked permission not to eat it. And then offered to explain why. So what about us in our culture today? What do we do when work colleagues form a lottery group? What do we do about joining colleagues for a drink after work? What do we do when there is dishonesty in the workplace? We want to be part of the team. We want to belong. We want to be relevant. But how do we do that without compromise? And what do we do when we're talking with neighbours down our road? What do we do with friends or the parents of our children's friends that we maybe meet them at swimming club or music club, wherever it may be? What do we do? What do we say when they start to talk about what's called same-sex marriage or gender confusion? We don't want to deliberately offend people. want to build good relationships with people. But how do we do that without compromise? Like Daniel. How do we learn to speak with respect and tact? Notice also how Daniel offered a suggestion here. He knew that the official was afraid of the king. He understood that the king had said the exiles must eat the food from his table. So how dare any of the officials allow them to eat something else? The official was in a difficult place, in the middle between the king and Daniel, who didn't want to eat this stuff. See how Daniel understood. See how Daniel sympathized. And see how Daniel looked for a good solution. Please, he said. Now, the Good News Bible doesn't include the word please there. That's because it's a very literal Hebrew word that's really very difficult to translate. It's more just a kind of request to somebody to hear you out and to do something for you. So I think the translation please is a really rather good one. Please test your servants. Daniel tried to go as far as he could with what was asked of him. Daniel tried to adapt to a new way of life in Babylon. Daniel accepted what he could, but he would not compromise on his faith or on any of the moral demands of God. How can we today, in our culture, in our world, be like Daniel? How can we be good news people who are relevant, but yet without compromise? I think it's far from easy. Our second example is the Apostle Paul, who explains for us his approach in 1 Corinthians 19. And in verse 19 he says, I'm free. I am nobody's slave. But I make myself everybody's slave in order to win as many as possible. Paul is often called the apostle of freedom. He preached the good news of freedom. Freedom from sin, freedom from guilt, freedom from death, freedom from the law. And nobody could take that freedom away. But freedom doesn't mean compromise. We don't compromise on the doctrine of the deity of Christ, or the necessity of his death, or that forgiveness is through grace alone. We don't compromise on moral matters of honesty and integrity and purity and marriage, what it means to be a man or a woman. But Paul will adapt his behavior and his ways according to the people that he is with. And he tells us that he does that in order that he may win some to Christ. Several years ago, Angela and I lived in Sri Lanka for 5 years. And I shall never forget something that happened within the first week or 10 days. A friend came and arrived at Bible college. We had already sat down to eat dinner. And he came and he said, hi, and he stopped in the doorway. And he looked. And he said, you're in my country. You're eating my food, and you're eating it my way. He meant we were making a bit of a hash of trying to use our fingers. But then he said, so you're my friends. You see, sharing food and eating it in the Sri Lankan manner was a great way of fitting into that culture and that way of life. There's nothing wrong with eating food that way. It's great. But it opened up gospel opportunities. And so here in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul begins to explain what he means by that with 3 simple examples. He says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. Now, have you ever wondered why one day Paul refused for Titus to be circumcised, and then the next, well, not exactly the next day, but very soon after, was quite happy for Timothy to be circumcised? What's that all about? Sounds a little bit like a chameleon, doesn't it? Going along with whatever was right on that day. Not so. With Titus, the situation was this. There were some people in the church at Galatia who insisted that Titus must be circumcised if he wants to be saved. Now, Paul knows that we are saved not by any kind of works at all, only through the grace of God in which we trust. And so the demand for Titus to be circumcised was a challenge to the very message of the good news itself. The situation with Timothy was quite different. There was no gospel issue at stake here. There was no moral issue at stake. That's why Paul was willing for Timothy to be circumcised. And actually it was helpful, because it meant that the Jews in that place were willing to welcome Paul and Timothy, and willing to listen to the message of the good news that they had. I think that's the reason for the different actions. And for me, it's one example of what it meant for Paul to say to the Jews, I became like a Jew. He would not compromise on any theological issue or any moral issue. But he did accept the customs and the habits of Jewish people in order to gain a hearing for the gospel. It was relevance without compromise. And the second example he gives is this. To those who were under the law, I became like one under the law. Now, there were some people in Corinth who wanted to keep all the laws and traditions of Judaism. And there were others who wanted to emphasize the freedom that we have from the law. And so that statement, and the one he adds next, is pretty much guaranteed to alienate most of the congregation. Sometimes that's the challenge that a preacher or a pastor has to face. So those under the law, said Paul, I became like one under the law. But immediately adds, I'm not under the law. What he means is that he could live in a way that is described by the law. So, for example, not eating certain food like pork. And he could live that way as long as it did not involve sin. So if those under the law ate certain foods, he would eat. If those under the law didn't eat certain foods, then he wouldn't. He knew that all foods were clean. But he knew that to eat pork, for example, would alienate and push away those who lived under the law. So he says, to those who are under the law, I lived as if I was under the law. But to those who were without the law, I lived as if I was without the law. Now, careful. He doesn't mean that he became lawless. He didn't mean anything goes. No, that would be slavery to sin. And in Christ we've been forgiven, we've been set free, so that we now live differently. We're not under the law. Therefore, as long as we don't sin, we can live as those without the law. That phrase, 1 Corinthians 9, is simply a description of everybody who is Gentile, that is, non-Jew. Because it was one of the privileges of the Jews to have God's law. And so Paul is simply saying that when he was with Gentiles, he could go along with their customs so long as he didn't sin. He was free to eat pork. There was nothing wrong with that. And indeed, when he was with Gentiles, it could be helpful. And that's the point. He accommodated himself to the people he was with. When he was Gentiles, he was with Gentiles. And they didn't have the law of God. He met them where they were. Now, he wasn't the only person like that. Some of the Jewish teachers, such as Hillel, said, we should not make the law a bigger burden than necessary, because we want to help people to accept our Jewish faith. Paul just goes further. He doesn't bring them under the law at all. And yet, at the same time, he is equally committed to living in purity and following the ethical demands of God. Once again, I think it's relevance without compromise. Finally, he says, to the weak, I became like one who is weak. And the word here and in Romans chapter 14 refers to certain Christian believers who were very sensitive about some things. They weren't of fundamental importance, and they weren't wrong in themselves. And so in Romans 14, Paul deals with that in terms of the celebration of certain festivals and of certain food laws. So, for example, some of the weak believers in Rome just felt uneasy about eating pork. They knew they weren't under the law anymore, but they still just didn't feel comfortable to do that. So Paul says, okay, I recognize their weak conscience. He said, I'm not going to force you to eat. He would meet them where they were. You see, a few verses earlier, he had simply said, take care that your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Once again, I think it is relevance without compromise. And in all of those ways, Paul says, I become all things to all people. And that's how good news people live in their culture, without compromise. It's to live like Daniel, a young man in a strange culture with so many idols and customs that were different to what he knew back home. Daniel fitted in where he could, but he would be relevant without compromise. It's to live like Paul, who so wanted other people to hear the gospel of Jesus, he would do whatever he could to fit in with their way of life, unless it was wrong. He didn't compromise on gospel truth, and he didn't compromise on God's ethical demands. In Sri Lanka, we helped with a Bible college in the northeast. And in that first week that we were there, we needed to buy some lunch packets in the middle of the day. So we said to the students, you like vegetarian or fish or egg? Some of the students said, can we have beef? So I looked at them and I said, well, where are we? And they're like, what? I said, what's the name of the place where we are? They were probably thinking in their mind, sir, are you completely stupid? But eventually I got them to realize that we were in a place where 90% of the population was Hindu, that beef comes from the cow, and the Hindu considers the cow to be a sacred animal. It would not be helpful for building relationships if they saw a new Christian college feasting on roast beef. We were free to eat it, and we were free not to eat it. And we made a choice not to, because we thought it would help us to win others for Christ. That's what it means to live as good news people in our culture. This is how good news people can be relevant without compromise. It's not easy, but may God help us to be wise and to be brave and to do it. Amen.